Hi, and welcome to this video on strategic analysis with a focus on both external and internal analysis. So when we think about external and internal analysis, what are we talking about? Well, once a company has an understanding of what its intentions are and where it's heading, so who are we, where do we play, what are we interested in, what's our mission, what's our vision, etc., then it can perform external and internal analyses to look at where it currently is. So it's a really good way of understanding strengths and weaknesses internally and the opportunities and threats that the company faces externally. External and internal analyses will establish what the strategic position currently is. So what are we doing right now, and what are the things that face us and what they might be in the future too. There are so many tools out there to perform these analyses. The ones that we're going to look at here are the most common in the sense that they're taught at business schools, companies use them. There is a general language around these models. People know about them when you talk to them about them. And they're going to provide an insight into the types of issues that external and internal analyses might also focus on and reveal. So we'll use them as a vehicle to think about what are the challenges with internal and external analysis more generally, and what are the opportunities that they provide. So let's start then with external analysis. We want to frame this up in terms of the types of external analysis you can do. So if we look at the levels of analysis that we might undertake in relation to an organisation, we can look just at the competitors, we can look at the whole industry, we can look at the macro environment. There are three external levels that we can think about. And then internally, we can look at the organisation itself. So initially, let's think about a PESTEL analysis, which takes place at a macro environmental level. Here, we're mainly seeking to spot threats and opportunities that might face us in the broad environment, so we can minimise or seize these opportunities or threats respectively. So the PESTEL model is just one of many ways of categorising environmental factors. Here there are 6 key types. So political, economic, social, technological, ecological and legal factors. I'm not going to go into this in detail here because it's covered really well in the notes and it's a very straightforward model. So I'm going to save the time we have together instead to talk about the more complicated elements. But just to quickly pick on the strengths and weaknesses of a PESTEL model. So firstly, it's potentially too simple, simplistic, but the simplicity might also be a good thing. So in other words, is it good to have a model that's so straightforward to use, or does it mean we might overlook things? It can be very revealing of elements of these factors. So for example, if we were to do a PESTEL analysis and it really focuses us in on the technological aspects of what's going on that might affect our company, but are there gaps between the different letters of the PESTEL? So for example, we haven't got ethical in here, whereas a STEEPLE analysis adds an extra E and adds in ethics. Should we be considering that? Is there then something else on top that we're still forgetting? And we might feel that by using a model, we're comfortable, we're safe, we're prepared for all eventualities, but it can make us a bit overconfident and lead us to forget about our blind spots because we just think, well, we've done an analysis, we've found out what we need to know, and we forget to keep looking. So then next, we'll look at the next 2 layers down, the grey and the red, the industry and competitors. So looking at the industry and the competitive landscape of the industry, we can look at Porter's 5 forces, which is the best known example of a tool or model to help us analyse these elements. And Porter's 5 forces shows us that some industries are more profitable than others based on a combination of 5 factors. These are the 5 factors. We cover these in the notes for the unit 2, so you can read more there. But essentially, they are threat of new entrants, supplier power, threat of substitutes, and buyer power. And then slightly different intensity of rivalry, which is fed by the other 4 components, but has some factors itself, as you'll see in a moment. So the greater the strength of each of these forces, the less profitable the industry is, whereas the weaker the forces are. So for example, if there's low supplier power or low buyer power, then the more profitable the industry is. Okay, so let's start to look at these different components then. So threat of new entrants. How likely is it that new players are going to enter the market? Or if you're already in the market, remember that you want the threat of new entrants to be low. So there's 2 elements to this. Firstly, is the market attractive to those who aren't in it yet? Does it have high industry growth, high profit margins, few existing competitors, or easy customer switching. The more of these which are true, and the degree to which they're true, will make the market more attractive to new people coming in and will increase the threat of new entrants. What are the barriers to entry? You will also want to think about. So are there economies of scale that you get if you're in the industry and you're already big, which it's hard to exploit when you first start in the industry? Is there strong brand loyalty? Are there big capital requirements? So do you need a big financial investment to get set up in the industry to start with? Is there access to distribution channels that are closed for those who are not in the industry yet? Is it run on patents? So for example, pharmaceutical, very difficult to get into it because it's governed by patents. There's high capital requirements because it's expensive to do the R&D, and there's economies of scale to producing, and government subsidies. So the higher the barriers to entry are, the lower the threat of new entrants will be. People won't want to go into the market because there are barriers to entry. The second element, the second factor, the second force of Porter's 5 forces is threat of substitutes. And here we're interested in whether substitutes are available and are consumers likely to switch to them. So firstly, we need to think about how available different substitutes are. They could be substitutes from different industries. So for example, substituting rail travel for air travel, or from sub-industries. So tinned versus frozen dog food, for example. And we also want to think about whether there's much likelihood of people switching to those substitutes. Well, there'll be an increased likelihood if the price of substitution is low. If the price of the substitute is low. So if it's not an expensive substitute product, people are more likely to swap, particularly if it's lower than your product. If there are low perceived switching costs, so it's not an expensive thing in terms of time or money. So if you think about swapping from an Android phone to an Apple phone, that's got quite high switching costs, not just because the purchase of the phone, but the effort of converting everything over to different apps, different ways of doing things. There's also relative benefits, make it an increased likelihood that people will swap. So if the substitute is comparable or better quality. Note here that when we're talking about substitutes, we're not talking about substitutes within the industry. We're talking about substitutes outside the industry. So for example, if you were thinking about the wine industry, then a substitute would be beer or not drinking or vodka. What we're saying is that we're analysing always with Porter's 5 forces at the industry level, not at the company level. And so if we're analysing at the industry level, we're looking at substitutes to the industry. Third force, buyer power. So do customers have enough bargaining power to push down prices within this industry? It's going to be higher, so higher buyer power, if there are small numbers of large competitors. So if a customer can say, well, I'll go to your competitor if you don't push the price down. If there are very large numbers of competitors, so people are already competing ferociously. If there are low levels of product differentiation, low switching costs, if the customer's own profitability is low, so meaning that they really need to bargain the price down or they're not going to make any money. So particularly if you're buying, if that's a B2B sale, so business selling to another business. And then finally, if there's a high degree of price transparency in the market. So I've put this picture up of someone standing at a market stall because buying fruit and vegetables at a market, buyers have a high degree of power because there's a large number of fruit and vegetable stalls. The products aren't that differentiated. It's very low switching costs to go from one market stall holder to another. And there's a high degree of price transparency because you can see what everyone else is charging. Okay, then supplier power. So do suppliers have enough bargaining power to increase their prices? When you're thinking about suppliers, make sure you think broadly. It's not just providers of the raw materials, it's also people who provide services that your company needs. So for example, your cleaning products, or the people who you outsource your payroll to. And then also your employees and any hire workers also count as suppliers. So remember, if you're doing a Porter's 5 forces analysis, either in the exam or further afield, demonstrate your knowledge well by considering a range of different types of suppliers. And the bargaining power of these suppliers will be increased if there are a few large suppliers, if the supplier's products are differentiated, So in other words, you want the products from that supplier particularly. If there are high switching costs for the customers in the industry being analysed, so in other words, your suppliers, if you swap suppliers, you're going to have to pay a lot, or your people in your industry are going to have to pay a lot to switch to a different product. So for example, you might have to retool your factory equipment to make use of different materials from a different supplier because they require slightly different setup of your machinery. And also if the supplier has other buyers it can sell to instead, then they've got more power. And then intensity of rivalry. So here we're thinking about how intense is the competition between existing players in the market. All of the other factors add towards this, but we can also make the statement that it will be higher if there are large numbers of existing competitors, if there are high levels of fixed costs because everyone wants to make a profit, and so if there's lots of fixed costs to be covered, then there will be a lot of aggressive trying to win sales, win the market. If there's low industry growth, there's not a lot of new business to fight over. If there's low switching costs, high exit barriers, or high strategic importance. So if we evaluate Porter's 5 forces, then we can see it's backward looking and reflective. We can say the same about all of the internal or external analytic models, but the fact that it is backward looking means it doesn't really allow us to predict or to give us any advice about how to achieve improvements. It also assumes that you can draw a neat boundary around an industry. So the problem here, you can really see if you look at the publishing industry. Should we include self-publishing in that? Where do e-readers fit? What about the producers of the e-readers? What industry would Amazon go into? Is that in the publishing industry or somewhere else? What about Tesla? What about Google? So organizations are complex entities, and it's not easy to, for example, increase barriers to entry or reduce the bargaining power of suppliers or the threat of substitutes. So we're kind of stuck often in an industry with the set of factors that we have. Because if they were easy things to do well and get right, all firms would be doing them. And then we need to think about what happens when more than one company identifies a new spot in the market they'd like to adopt and a competitor identifies the same position. The model doesn't look at the dynamics of competition at all, or what happens when people start to move around the industry to try and become a more effective player. So there are some oversights, but one additional and absolutely key oversight is not recognizing that it's what is inside the company that counts. So Porter's 5 forces focuses entirely on industry factors, and the combination of resources, processes, people, and culture that a firm has is totally ignored. It's not just a case of seeing companies as being bundles of resources that can be moved around in a market. Actually, that bundle of resources, that culture, those people, those processes are central to the firm's approach to the market and how they are known to be. So we shouldn't overlook it, but Porter does. And as such, he makes it sound really simple to move the organisation around in an industry. And what we actually need to do is be factoring in what organisations do and how they do it. So in other words, combining an external analysis with an internal analysis, needing to take seriously the strengths and weaknesses that are inside a firm and doing a proper internal analysis. So that's where we turn to now, is strategic analysis, and in particular, the internal analysis. So why undertake an internal analysis then? Well, in exploring the criticisms of Porter's 5 forces, we recognise that the internal environment of the company needs to be considered too. So, for example, supermarkets are far from standard. Some are more successful than others, and they have different bundles of resources. Industry doesn't explain the differences in performance of companies within that industry. And the variations in the resources that they have, how they use the resources, that's going to be what affects their success. So an internal analysis provides important insight into a firm or organisation's resources and capabilities. We can read this quote: an organisation's resources are its assets, financial, physical, human and intangible, that it uses to develop, manufacture and deliver products to its customers. They're what the organisation has. So we should be able to identify an organisation's strengths and weaknesses, what it does well, what it has well, where its weaknesses are, what it doesn't own, what it doesn't do well. And the resource-based view does exactly this. It identifies what is valuable, rare, inimitable, and organised for in a company. In other words, which resources provide proper, decent benefits to a company. So when we think about valuable, then we're thinking about, is the firm able to exploit an opportunity or neutralize an external threat with the resource or capability? So let's choose excellent customer service then. So can the firm exploit an opportunity with excellent customer service? Yes, it possibly can. If it's in an industry where people aren't very good at customer service and it is the market leader and the customers care about it, then yes, that is definitely a valuable resource. Is it rare? So is control of the resource or capability in the hands of a relative few? Well, we might say no, it's not, but actually maybe if we're in an industry where people skills often aren't valued, so perhaps the IT industry is maybe perhaps unfairly labelled with that, but potentially customer service skills aren't as strong in the IT industry as they could be. So if you find a way to recruit really good people to do customer services in your company, then yes, they could be rare if there aren't lots of them out there in the IT sector who are really excellent at customer services. Is it inimitable? So that means, is it difficult to imitate? And will there be significant cost disadvantage to a firm trying to obtain, develop, or duplicate the resource or capability? Who knows? Can you duplicate really good customer service? Can you teach people to be excellent at customer service? And then finally, is it organised for? So is the firm organised, ready, and able to exploit the resource or capability? Is the firm organised to capture value? So you've got these really good people who do great customer service. Can you organise yourself in a way that fully captures the value? So what we will want to do when we're doing a resource-based analysis is start off by asking these questions. So is the resource or capability valuable? If it's not, then you've got a competitive disadvantage. If it is, then the next question we ask is it rare? If it is, then you move on to ask, is it inimitable? If it is, then you move on to ask, is it organised? If it's all of those things, then it can create sustained competitive advantage. So that is the sort of resource that you want to be going after, and you want to be very pleased if you have it. Inimitable resources and capabilities. Let's just say a little bit more about that factor. So inimitability, not possible to copy. So inimitability means that it's hard for competitors to imitate or substitute as a result of one or more of the following. Is it complex? So are there lots of interlinkages between the processes to make it, between perhaps stakeholders, customers, etc.? So is it complex? Is it hard to identify what precisely it is and to create the unique cocktail that has created that resource? Secondly, causal ambiguity. So it can be hard to identify causes and effects which underpin success. So how did you get that resource? How did you create it in the first place? What's led the company to being where they are? If it's hard to answer those questions, then it's going to be hard for a competitor to imitate that element. And culture and history. So rivals can't replicate the historical sequence of events. They occurred at a particular point in time with a particular set of factors and will have led the culture, the people, the processes to develop in a particular way. As such, the value is embedded in the culture and history. You can't separate it out. So if we use the example of Disney, Disney has a lot of inimitable resources where if you think about their theme parks, it's hard to recreate them because there's loads of interlinkages between the theme parks and the films that they make, and then the rides are connected to those. And then there's merchandise, and then stakeholders buy into it and customers really like it. And it's hard to unpick all of those things. It's also hard to identify causal ambiguity. So what precisely is it that led Disney to create a theme park and the theme park to be successful? And even if you could work it out, the culture and the history and the fact that it developed at a particular point in time, that cannot be recreated. So resource-based view is one way of looking at resources, but TSET suggests it doesn't go far enough, because whilst the resource-based view says that you can get sustained competitive advantage if a resource is valuable, rare, inimitable, and organised, he says that doesn't last indefinitely. And so what you need is to think about the dynamic capabilities approach. So if the market changes and a company needs to change, or if competitors figure out how to copy or better the resource, or if an organisation just needs to have the capacity to change, Then a dynamic capability is an organisation's ability to renew and recreate resources and capabilities that meet the needs of changing environments. So in other words, a dynamic capability is an ability to change. And you need, according to TEAS, you need that alongside resources in order to stay ahead of the market. So we could see that as an extension of the resource-based view. It's saying, yes, internal analysis is important. Yes, the resource-based view is good for identifying what might be important in a company, but perhaps we need to go a stage further and say it's not enough to have resources. We need the capabilities to change, to evolve as the market changes, and that is an important resource in and of itself. Okay, so evaluating the resource-based view then. Some people have questioned whether anything original is actually being offered by the resource-based view. It's just saying firms survive when they're good at what they do. It's also been said that success depends on continuous renewal of advantages through management activity. So in other words, it's good because it recognises that you need to be organised to take advantage of the resources that you have. Maybe it doesn't take it far enough because it doesn't go as far as dynamic capabilities. It's difficult to ascertain sometimes, though, precisely where the advantage lies. So is the advantage in an IT system, or the management of the IT system, or the way the IT system allows the firm to codify knowledge? So what is it that is precisely the resource? RBVs, the resource-based view, and dynamic capabilities try to make retrospective sense of success, which can be helpful, but we have to be careful not to be not to overread into that, because it's easy to apply a narrative to something that's happened in the past, harder to predict the future. Because we could look at Amazon and say it was Bezos's dogged belief in being an everything store that was their key resource, or we could say it was the people he hired, or his reliance on data, or his desire to be totally customer centric, or a combination of all of those, and we won't ever really know. Resource-based view also doesn't provide managers with specific guidance on how to increase the VRIO, so the value, rarity, inimitability, and organisedness qualities of our resources. So it doesn't give specific advice. Managers have to do that work themselves. So in conclusion then, if we pair internal analysis, resource-based view and dynamic capabilities, with external analysis, PESTEL and Porter's 5 forces, at the level of industry and the macro environment, we gain a relatively well-rounded view of the firm's environment. So we need them all together. As a result of this, and in combination with the mission, goals and stated objectives of the firm can now begin to make strategic choices, formulate strategies that fit its mission, vision, values, objectives, opportunities, threats, strengths and weaknesses. And you will be looking at strategy formulation in upcoming units. Thank you very much for listening. I hope you found it useful.